No, no, no! Get back, Darius, stop!
I can't lose him.
You're in violation. This is your warning. This boat's not yours to take! Ah!
Let's see how far he takes this. These numbers don't lie.
Then fix your numbers.
You better be careful. I always am.
You kept this from me till I knew I could trust. What is that? Don't ask unless you're ready.
You were right.
This is too big, man! Too late to turn back now. We can't do this! We have to!
Who's inside my office?
Darius, don't!
The Boatyard, Raymond Voss, signed the last page of the Maritime Environmental Violation Notice at 8:47 on a Tuesday morning, capped his pen, and allowed himself a small, private smile. 11 waterfront parcels on Riverside Wharf, 7 already acquired, 3 owners negotiating their exits. 1 parcel, Coastal Meridian, could not build around Cole's Marine and Repair by Friday. He told himself, Riverside Wharf would belong to Coastal Meridian Group, and that particular stretch of Savannah waterfront, 60 years of black-owned fishing history, would be quietly erased and replaced with something that generated real tax revenue. A marina resort. Maybe. Condominiums with a rooftop pool. He had not given a second thought to the man at the end of the pier. The one in the stained Carhartt jacket, crouched over a diesel engine, who had watched the inspection team leave without a word, without a flinch, without so much as a raised eyebrow. Raymond Voss was a man who had learned to read weakness, and that stillness, that absolute, unreadable stillness, he had mistaken it for defeat. He had no way of knowing that for the past 8 months, Darius Cole had been watching him back, from 8 feet underwater, through 4 fixed cameras that no one at the Port Authority had thought to look for. The Savannah River at dawn smells like salt and diesel and something older, something that belongs to the marsh and the mud and the Spanish moss hanging off the live oaks along the bank. Darius Cole had been waking up to that smell for 19 years. Ever since he bought the failing boatyard at the south end of Riverside Wharf for $62,000 cash and spent 14 months rebuilding it with 2 employees and his own hands, Cole's Marine and Repair sat at the end of a gravel road, flanked by wire fencing and hand-painted signs. The building itself was a converted boat shed, corrugated metal walls, a hydraulic lift that groaned like an old man getting out of a chair, and a coffee maker in the corner office that Darius had bought at a church sale in 2008 and refused to replace. 3 slips out front, space for 4 more vessels under the covered dry dock, a small apartment in the back where Darius lived alone at 58. Darius Cole was a large man, gone quietly to stillness. 6'1", 220 pounds. Most of it still muscle from decades of habit he couldn't shake. His hair had gone salt and pepper 5 years ago, and he'd kept it cropped close. His hands were the hands of a man who worked with them calloused across the palm, scarred at the knuckles, permanently stained with grease at the cuticles in a way that no amount of mechanic's soap ever fully fixed. He didn't talk much. The community at Riverside Wharf had learned that about him early. He showed up. He fixed what he said he'd fix. He charged less than the commercial yards on the north side of the river. When Walter Bream's shrimping boat broke down 3 days before the Thanksgiving run, Darius worked through the night without being asked and didn't add it to the bill. That was enough in a community that had been let down by nearly every institution that was supposed to help it. A man who simply did what he said was worth more than a man who talked well. Nobody at Riverside Wharf knew where Darius Cole had been before he arrived in Savannah in 2005, with a cashier's check and calluses already on his hands. He didn't offer, and they didn't ask. Some things, in communities that had survived this long, you learned not to push. What they did know was this: every family left on the wharf was in some kind of trouble with the Chatham County Port Authority. The Breams had received a noise ordinance violation in January. The Okafor family's commercial fishing license had been flagged for administrative review in March, a review that had now dragged on for 7 months with no resolution. The Delacroix brothers had fought a fuel storage violation since February, spending $4,000 on legal fees before finally settling. The Simmons family, who had operated a small bait and tackle shop on the wharf since 1991, lost their lease renewal in April when the Port Authority determined their structure failed to meet updated waterfront safety standards. The Simmons family had moved out in June. Their building was demolished in July. By August, a survey crew from Coastal Meridian Group had been spotted measuring the empty lot. Darius had watched all of it from the end of his pier, a cup of coffee in his hand. Saying nothing, he had been watching for much longer than anyone knew. Raymond Voss had been director of the Chatham County Port Authority for 14 years, and before that, 8 years as a maritime attorney. He understood, with precision, exactly how much legal pressure a small waterfront business could absorb before it gave way. He was 51. Trim, silver-framed glasses, the kind of tan that came from weekend sailing. He had been photographed for the Savannah Morning News 3 times, environmental initiatives, a youth sailing program, a conservation award, by every public measure, a dedicated public servant. The arrangement with Coastal Meridian Group had begun 38 months ago over dinner at a restaurant on River Street. Voss had not needed much convincing. He had told himself, at the time, that this was because the math was obvious. Riverside Wharf occupied 2 acres of prime Savannah waterfront, property tax revenue from the 11 waterfront businesses, fishing operations, the Simmons bait shop, and Cole's repair yard totaled less than $40,000 annually. A boutique, hotel, and marina complex on the same footprint would generate 8 times that, plus construction jobs, plus hospitality, employment, plus a tax base that could fund the school repairs and road resurfacing that Chatham County had been deferring for a decade. Voss had run the numbers himself. He had a graduate degree in public administration. He understood civic economics. The families had been there a long time. He understood that too. But long time wasn't the same as forever. And sentiment wasn't the same as policy. The world moved. Cities redeveloped. The families who'd built Riverside Wharf in the 1960s had done something remarkable, but their grandchildren were operating equipment that was 40 years old in a market that had fundamentally changed. He was not displacing a thriving community. He was accelerating an inevitable one. That was what he told himself. For about 4 months, Coastal Meridian's contact, a man named Patrick Ellery, who wore Ferragamo loafers and never shook hands too firmly, had explained it as a managed transition. The families would receive fair market offers for their equipment. The community would be relocated. Nobody needed to get hurt. What Voss had not been told, what Ellery had carefully omitted, was that Coastal Meridian's development plans included a private deep-water access channel that would run directly beneath the wharf, and that the reason Ellery needed that particular stretch of waterfront, and needed it with no active fishing operations and no independent eyes nearby, had nothing to do with rooftop pools or civic economics. Voss had figured that out in month 4. By then, he had told himself the rationalization so many times that he could no longer locate the exact moment he had crossed from facilitating development into facilitating something else. That boundary, in his memory, had become pleasantly blurred. He had learned, over the previous 3 decades in public life, that most men who ended up where he was hadn't chosen it in one dramatic moment. They had just kept choosing the easier thing, one step at a time. until the distance between who they'd been and who they were had become too large to comfortably measure. He had stopped measuring. The inspection team arrived shortly after 7 on a Tuesday morning in the second week of October. 2 men from the Port Authority's Environmental Compliance Division clipboard, camera, latex gloves, the whole performance. Darius was in the middle of replacing the raw water impeller on a 3-4-foot tiara belonging to a dentist from Bluffton, South Carolina. He set down his tools, wiped his hands on a rag, and walked to the end of the dock. Mr. Cole, the senior inspector, a man named Pruitt, extended his hand without quite meeting Darius's eyes. Keith Pruitt, Environmental Compliance. We've received a report of potential Clean Water Act violations originating from this property. We'll need access to your facility. What kind of violations? Darius asked. Petroleum discharge. We have a recorded observation of oil sheen consistent with used diesel or hydraulic fluid entering the waterway. We've mapped the point source to coordinates originating within your property boundary. Darius looked at him steadily. What are the coordinates? Pruitt hesitated. Then he read them off his clipboard. Darius nodded once. Slowly. I understand. Go ahead. He stood at the edge of the dock and watched them move through the yard for 90 minutes. He watched them photograph the oil separator tank, the used fluid disposal drums, the Bilger pump station. He watched Pruitt's partner, a younger man who couldn't hold eye contact, crouch near the water's edge and collect a sample that Darius suspected had been pre-staged. He said nothing. He signed the preliminary citation when they handed it to him. The fine was $40,000, a 90-day suspension of operations, effective at 5 o'clock that afternoon. The 3 8-foot Hatterers, currently in Slip 2, the Miss Lorraine, owned by Thomas Brough, a commercial crabber whose family had worked Savannah waters for 3 generations, was placed under a temporary environmental hold and could not leave the slip pending additional water sampling. We'll need the vessel keys, Pruitt said. Darius reached into his jacket pocket and put the keys on the clipboard without a word. After they left, his 2 employees, Malik, 26 and 4 years into the job, and an older Haitian man everyone called Pear, who spoke little English and understood everything, stood in the door of the repair shed looking at him. What we gonna do? Mr. D. Malik asked. Darius picked up his coffee cup from the dock post where he'd left it. It had gone cold. He drank it anyway. Those coordinates, he said, are 40 meters north-northwest of our property line. He looked out at the water. There's no pipe of ours within 60 meters of that location. Malik and Pear exchanged a look. So what do we do? Malik asked again. Right now, Darius said, we finish the tiara. The man's paying by the hour. He went back into the shed. He did not tell them that he already knew exactly what was at those coordinates. He had known for 8 months. 3 days after the citation, the Savannah Coastal Gazette ran a brief item in the business section, Riverside Wharf Boatyard, cited for environmental violations. 4 paragraphs. A photograph of the yard taken from the water. Darius hadn't given anyone permission to be on the water side of his property, which told him the photo came from a Port Authority vessel. 2 of the 4 paragraphs quoted Raymond Voss directly, expressing the authority's commitment to holding waterfront businesses to the same environmental standards we apply across our entire jurisdiction. By the weekend, 3 of Darius's regular clients had called to say they were moving their boats to the North River Marine Center until the situation was resolved. He didn't argue. He thanked them for calling. The maritime attorney on Drayton Street declined the case without meeting Darius's eyes. The Coast Guard station serving Savannah referred him, in writing, to the Port Authority's administrative appeals process to contest a citation issued by the Port Authority the following Monday evening. His son called. Marcus Cole was 31 years old and lived in Atlanta, where he worked as a project manager for a mid-sized construction firm. He and his father had not spoken in any real way for 7 years, not since Marcus was 24, and had finally, in the middle of a Thanksgiving argument that had been building for a decade, said the thing he'd been holding, I don't know who you are, Bah. I never have. And I'm done pretending that's normal. Darius had not argued. He had not explained. He had said, I know. And Marcus had left the next morning, and their relationship since then had been birthday texts and an occasional 5-minute phone call at Christmas. When Marcus's name appeared on Darius's phone screen, Darius watched it ring twice before answering. I saw the article. Marcus said, no preamble. Online. A client of mine sent it to me, asked if it was my father. I didn't know what to say. It's a regulatory dispute. Darius said, I'm handling it. They're saying you dumped oil into the river. I didn't. Silence on the line. The kind of silence between two people who have said the necessary words but are not saying the real ones. Is this going to get worse? Marcus asked. Probably. Darius said. Another silence. You need anything? Darius looked out the small window of his apartment above the shop. The river was black in the dark. Moving slow. No. He said, I'm good. After he hung up, he sat at his workbench for a long time. On the bench in front of him were two things, the printed citation documents and an envelope he had received that afternoon containing a letter from Coastal Meridian Group's legal division. The letter expressed sympathies regarding his regulatory situation and noted that Coastal Meridian remained interested in acquiring his property if he wished to discuss terms. An attached offer sheet put the number at $180,000. The land alone, at current waterfront rates, was worth north of $400,000. The business, the equipment, the reputation. 19 years. That was worth considerably more. $180,000. Retire. Walk away. Let the city have its resort, and Marcus would never have to know. Darius picked up the offer letter, read it once more, and set it down. Then he stood up, moved to the back corner of the shop, and crouched in front of a floor safe bolted beneath the secondary workbench. He worked the combination left, right, left, and pulled the heavy door open. Inside a Pelican case, matte black, foam-lined, a satellite phone on a charging cradle, an encrypted laptop in a neoprene sleeve, a hard drive, unlabeled, approximately the size of a paperback novel. He plugged the hard drive into the laptop, the screen filled with time-stamped video files, hundreds of them, organized by date going back to February. The footage was dark underwater footage, shot from fixed-position cameras in roughly 6 to 8 feet of water. The image quality was exceptional. The cameras, which had cost $11,000 apiece and required an understanding of underwater housing pressure ratings that most civilians did not possess, had been placed at 4 positions around the northern boundary of the wharf over the course of 3 nights in early spring. Darius scrolled to a file from 6 weeks ago. He double-clicked it. On the screen, in the green-tinged glow of the low-light lens, a small, unmanned submersible moved through the water at approximately 4 knots. Running without lights, it passed through the frame moving south. A second camera had picked it up 3 minutes later, moving toward a specific point beneath the main access channel. Across 4 camera positions, he had recorded 41 usable passes, representing 14 complete transit cycles over 8 months. Schedules, patterns, entry and exit vectors. On 2 occasions, the camera had captured enough of the submersible's hull to read partial markings. He picked up the satellite phone and dialed a number from memory. It rang 4 times. Then a voice, rough, Louisiana edged, deliberately slow, said, "You know what time it is. I need you in Savannah." Darius said, "A pauser. How long you been sitting on this?" Before calling. 8 months. I'll be there Thursday. Calvin Broussard said, "You still have your dive certifications current, brother." Calvin Broussard said, "Don't insult me." Calvin Broussard arrived on a Thursday afternoon, driving a white Ford Transit with Louisiana plates and a magnetic sign on the side that read, Gulf Coast Marine Systems Underwater Inspection and Survey. He was 55 years old, built like a retired fullback, with a shaved head and a beard going grey at the chin. He had served 22 years in the Navy, retiring as a Master Chief Petty Officer after assignments that included SEAL Team 4. Afterward, he settled in New Orleans and built a legitimate business doing exactly what his van suggested: underwater hull inspection, marine structure assessment, and the occasional classified consulting job that didn't appear on any invoice. He and Darius had served together for 11 years. They had not needed to speak much in those years, and they didn't need to now. Calvin spent 2 hours reviewing the hard drive footage in silence, occasionally rewinding, occasionally marking timestamps on a yellow legal pad. When he was done, he closed the laptop and sat back in his chair. "Tell me what you think," Darius said. 16 to 18 days between full runs, Calvin said. Launching from somewhere beyond the normal harbor approaches a cargo vessel sitting far enough out to blend into commercial traffic rendezvous with a retrieval point somewhere along this access channel. He tapped the nautical chart. Here. Or here. That's what I think too. What's it carrying? I don't know exactly, but it's running dark, running silent, and it's using a channel that's directly beneath property that Coastal Meridian has been systematically clearing of witnesses for 3 years. Darius paused. Someone needs that water to be empty. Calvin nodded slowly. And Voss is their man at the Port Authority. His inspectors have active citations against all 3 families, still operating beside me. 7 others are already gone. Because you've got eyes in the water. Because I've got eyes in the water. Calvin looked at the chart for another moment. So why haven't you taken this to the FBI? Darius was quiet. You already tried, Calvin said. It wasn't a question, not formally. I ran the name of the special agent in charge for the Savannah field office, Robert Kenway. He was appointed to that position 18 months ago, following a recommendation from Senator Alan Pruitt. Darius paused. Senator Pruitt's Family Investment Trust holds a 7.4% stake in Coastal Meridian Group through a fund called Low Country Capital Partners. Calvin stared at him. You found that yourself. I had time. Calvin exhaled through his nose. So we can't go through the local FBI. We can go to them. Darius said. We just can't go to them first. He stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the wharf was quiet. The Miss Lorraine sat impounded in her slip, her lines still tied exactly as he'd left them. If we walk into Kenway's office with footage of submersible transits in a federal waterway, one of 2 things happens. Best case, he buries it because his career depends on not finding it. Worst case, he flags us to Voss, and Voss accelerates the timeline. So what's the play? Darius turned from the window. We find out who's upstream of Voss. We build the full trail. Then we take it to someone who doesn't have a reason to bury it. Calvin picked up his legal pad and looked at his notes. 16 to 18 day cycle. Based on the last transit. We've got about a week before the next run. 7 days. If the pattern holds, then I need to get in the water tonight. Calvin said, I want to see where that thing is going. He picked up his coffee and drank the rest of it. And you need to send Voss something. Shake him a little. See how he moves when he's nervous. I was thinking the same thing. Darius said, that night, after Calvin had suited up and slipped into the black water beneath the northern pier, Darius sat at his workbench and wrote 3 lines on a blank index card in block letters. He printed the coordinates of the submersible's primary transit path, the same coordinates Pruitt had incorrectly cited as the location of the oil discharge. He wrote the times of the last 3 runs. He sealed it in a plain white envelope. No return address. He would mail it from a post office on the east side of town, below the coordinates. He wrote, I know the schedule. He sat looking at it for a moment. Then he sealed the envelope. Calvin came back up at 2 in the morning, dripping onto the dry dock planking. and didn't say anything for a full minute. He pulled off his mask and sat down on a dock cleat. There's a retrieval cradle in the main channel cut, he said. About 60 meters north of your property line, 20 feet down, anchored into the bedrock, submersible docks to it, offloads, and a tender retrieves the container from a submerged recovery float tethered above it. What's in the containers? Calvin looked at him. I found one that hadn't been picked up yet. Partial transit. Something went wrong with the tender schedule. I think the container was still locked to the cradle. He paused. I didn't open it, but I got my hand on it. Denser, very dense for its size. And there were customs markings on the exterior, Chilean export seals. But the container dimensions don't match any standard Chilean commodity manifest I've ever seen. Darius was quiet. Gold. Maybe platinum working theory, until somebody opens one, Calvin said. Somebody's moving refined metal through your channel to avoid customs declaration. That's why they need the water empty. A tender operation near a recovery float gets noticed if there are fishing boats in the area. Darius sat with that. Gold. Not drugs. Not weapons. Something that looked legitimate until you followed it far enough upstream. The operation had a shape now, still theory, but theory with the weight of 8 months of footage behind it. A cargo vessel sitting beyond the normal harbor approaches far enough out to blend into commercial traffic. From its hull, an unmanned submersible running through the shipping lane at depth, dark and silent, docking to the retrieval cradle in the bedrock, cut 20 feet down. Above the cradle, a submerged recovery float on a tether, invisible from the surface. Accessible only to someone who knew exactly where to look. Voss's people, Calvin said quietly. Port authority, tender, legitimate markings. They collect the container. Nobody on the wharf sees a thing. And on the other end, that part, I don't know yet, but both of them could see the shape of it. The wharf wasn't incidental to the operation. It was the operation, and someone had gone to considerable trouble to ensure it stayed invisible. An operation that had never needed to be violent because it had never needed to be visible. Until now, we need to go to IRS CI tonight. Calvin said, not in a week. Tonight. I can get you a contact, Treasury. Not FBI. Somebody outside Kenway's reach. We give them the cradle location, the container, the footage. They send a dive team before the next transit, and it's over. No. Darius said. Calvin looked at him. Darius, if Treasury hits the cradle tonight, Ellery burns his contractors, and Voss claims he never knew what the channel was for. We catch the shipment and lose the men who built the system. The cradle is evidence of the operation. It is not evidence that Voss directed it. Darius set the envelope on the workbench. I need him to respond to those coordinates. I need him tied to whatever he does next. When a man reacts to something he was never supposed to know about, that reaction becomes evidence of what he knew. He might walk anyway if we wait too long, not if he gives us the connection we're missing. Darius said, but I need him to keep moving. I need more of his network on record before we close it. You're gambling with people's property, Calvin said. The Okafors. The Breams, every week you wait, is another week. Voss can manufacture a new citation. I know that. Then, you know you might be wrong. The words sat between them. Darius picked up the sealed envelope and looked at it. Send me the Treasury contact, he said. I'm going to write the IRS CI letter tonight, but I mail it in 5 days. Not now. 5 days to let Voss respond to this envelope and show us who else he calls. Calvin looked at him for a long moment. 5 days, he said. Then I send the contact myself. It was the closest they had come to an argument in 30 years. Darius mailed the envelope the next morning. Voss received the envelope on a Monday morning. His assistant brought it in with the rest of his mail, and he opened it last, expecting nothing, and found 3 lines of block-printed text and a set of coordinates that made his stomach drop through the floor. He read it twice. Then he picked up his desk phone and called Patrick Ellery. "We have a problem," Voss said. "How large?" Voss looked at the coordinates. Large. He made 3 more calls that afternoon. His environmental compliance team was instructed to accelerate the Cole proceeding move for an emergency injunction to seal the property, cite the ongoing investigation as grounds. His personal attorney was told to research the limits of emergency maritime seizure authority under Georgia state law, and a man he knew from his time as a maritime attorney, a man who did private investigative work that didn't appear on any formal invoice, was given Darius Cole's address and told to learn everything there was to learn about him. Across the hall, Gerald Fitch, the Port Authority's records administrator, watched 3 unusual deletion requests enter the system within 20 minutes. Fitch had worked under Voss for 9 years and had learned not to ask questions aloud. He preserved the logs before processing the first request. The man came back 2 days later with a file that was, in his own words, basically empty. Darius Cole, born 1966, Richmond, Virginia. No college records on file. Employment history from 1989 to 2005 listed as federal contractor. Various. Purchased Riverside Wharf property in 2005. Clean credit. No criminal record. No civil litigation history. Federal contractor. Voss repeated, "That's it, that's it. Whatever he did before 2005, it's either classified or scrubbed." Voss didn't know what to do with that. So he did what men in his position always did when they encountered something they couldn't read. He decided it didn't matter. He was wrong. Marcus called Darius again that evening. "Not about the article this time. I've been thinking about what you said." Marcus started. "About the regulatory dispute. And I looked up Coastal Meridian just out of curiosity. They filed a development permit application with Chatham County 6 weeks ago. It's public record." Darius waited. "I do this for a living." "Bah. I read construction plans all day, and there's something in their site drawings that doesn't add up." Marcus paused. Darius could hear him moving. The sound of papers. They're showing a subsurface utility corridor running north along the channel bed. They've permitted it as a stormwater drainage upgrade. But the dimensions are wrong. The bore diameter is 3 times what you'd need for drainage, and the depth profile shows it running under the existing lease parcels, not around them. "What would you build a bore that size for?" Darius asked. "Access. Some kind of retrieval infrastructure. Something that needs to go up and down regularly from the water." Another pause. "I don't know what they're moving, but whatever it is, they need a clear channel above it and a direct line to the surface. The whole development plan is built around that corridor. The hotel, the marina, it's all secondary. The corridor is the point." Darius was quiet for a long moment. "Marcus," he said, "don't file anything. Don't contact the county. Don't talk to anyone about this. I wasn't planning to. I mean it. Whatever you figured out, keep it to yourself for now." Another silence. "Are you going to tell me what's actually happening when I can?" Darius said. "Not yet." He heard his son exhale. Not angry, resigned. In the way of someone who had been given that answer before and had stopped expecting a different one. "Be careful," Marcus said. He hung up. Darius set down the phone and looked at the nautical chart on his workbench. Calvin had been right about the cradle location. And Marcus, 31 years old, reading construction permits in an Atlanta office, had just independently confirmed the infrastructure from a completely different angle. 2 separate threads. Arriving at the same point, that was the final piece. Once the wharf was cleared and the development built, Coastal Meridian would have a permanent, private, below waterline access route with no independent vessels overhead, not a drainage corridor. Smuggling infrastructure disguised as civic improvement, and Marcus, reading permits in an Atlanta office, had found it without knowing what he was looking at. He called Elena Vasquez the following afternoon. He had found her work 3 months ago, a ProPublica investigation into what she called regulatory displacement along the South Carolina coast, where black-owned fishing families had faced coordinated environmental citations before their waterfront properties were acquired by development groups. It was methodical, sourced, and had resulted in 0 consequences thus far. But it was the right shape. She picked up on the second ring. "My name is Darius Cole," he said. "I have a boatyard in Savannah, Georgia. I think I have the next version of your story." She was in Savannah by Friday. They met at the boatyard after dark. Elena Vasquez was 43, compact and precise. With a reporter's habit of looking at things longer than was comfortable, she had a recorder in her jacket pocket and a legal pad in her bag, and she had not asked if she could use either, which Darius appreciated. He did not show her the underwater footage. He showed her the pattern 11 parcels, 3 years, a cascade of regulatory violations that followed the same template with cosmetic variations. He showed her the Coastal Meridian acquisition map, how each business that had settled had been followed within weeks by a survey crew and within months by a demolition permit. He did not tell her about the submersibles. Not yet. What he gave her was enough to write the first article, not about Cole, about the pattern. "If I run this without naming Voss or Coastal Meridian directly," she said, looking at the map, "you're giving them advance warning." "I know. So why? Because I need Voss to move," Darius said. "When he moves, he's going to make mistakes. And when he makes mistakes, I'm going to be there." Elena looked at him for a moment with the particular expression of a person recalculating who they're talking to. "How do you know he'll move instead of going to ground?" "Because he can't afford to go to ground," Darius said. "Whatever is running through that channel has a schedule. He can't stop the schedule. He can only try to eliminate the threat. The threat being you. The threat being this conversation. The threat being anything that brings eyes to this stretch of water at the wrong time." Elena wrote something on her legal pad. "What do you want from this?" "Mr. Cole, the wharf," he said simply. "I want these families to keep their businesses, and I want the people who spent 3 years taking that away from them to answer for it in a federal court." She looked at him a moment longer. Then she nodded and put the cap back on her pen. What he gave her that night was the pattern 11 parcels, the acquisition map, the citation timeline, the underwater footage, and the financial trail he kept back. Not yet. The next morning, 5 days after Voss had received the envelope, Darius sent the IRS CI package. Calvin's treasury contact provided the name of an evidence intake officer in Atlanta and a case reference number. The drive went by bonded courier, 4 pages of documentation, the encrypted footage drive, a sealed password envelope, signed for at the field office by name. 2 days later, confirmation came back through Calvin's contact that the package had been received and logged. That afternoon, Darius called Elena. "I'm ready to give you the rest," he said. He sent her the underwater footage and the financial trail he had held back during their first meeting. Federal evidence first, press after. In that order, for a reason. The article ran the following Tuesday. 1,200 words. No names. A pattern of pressure, how regulatory citations are reshaping Savannah's historic waterfront. The families were described by their circumstances: third-generation fishermen, a bait shop established in 1991, a vessel repair operation with 19 years of operation. The timeline was laid out plainly. Voss read it the morning it published. By noon, he had called Ellery 3 times. By that afternoon, he had done exactly what Darius had predicted. He sent someone to the boatyard. The man arrived just after 9 on a Wednesday night. Coming from the waterside, a small inflatable running, a low-noise electric outboard barely above idle. Calvin had been watching from the covered dry dock with a night vision monocular he'd brought from New Orleans, and he tracked the man from the moment he tied off at the North Cleat. The man moved with professional quietness, which told Darius he was not law enforcement. Law enforcement would have come with a warrant and headlights. The motion sensors inside the shop triggered silently, logging timestamps. The man spent 22 minutes inside the main building. He was careful, methodical. He opened the filing cabinet near the door, the secondary workbench drawers, the parts storage lockers. He did not find the floor safe because the floor safe was under a steel equipment rack that appeared to be welded to the floor and was not. He photographed several documents. What he photographed were maintenance records, invoice copies, and a set of navigational charts that Darius had left on the workbench charts that showed the waterway approaches to the wharf in detail, but nothing else. After he left, Calvin came inside and set the monocular on the bench. He had photographed the man with a long lens camera from the dry dock face, body, the inflatable, and a partial registration number on the outboard. "I'll run the registration," Calvin said. It came back the next morning. The inflatable was registered to a company called Stanchion Marine Consulting, LC, incorporated in Florida. The listed principal was a man named Brian Tullos. A background check, the kind that required resources that Calvin still had access to and that Darius did not ask about, showed that Brian Tullos had a 2009 federal conviction for extortion, reduced to a misdemeanor through plea agreement, and a list of subsequent contracts in maritime surveillance, private security, and electronic countermeasure equipment registered through Stanchion Marine. Not a simple private investigator. A man who operated at the edge of what was traceable. Someone tied to Tullos had conducted an illegal entry into a private property, and Tullos, Darius was increasingly certain, was working for Voss. The phone records, when they came, would confirm it. "He's scared," Calvin said. "He's desperate." Darius corrected. "There's a difference. Scared people hide. Desperate people make moves they can't take back." He put the photo of Tullos, the registration information, and the motion sensor timestamps into a folder. Then he added it to the growing archive on the encrypted drive. During the 2 weeks Elena spent reporting, one scheduled transit passed through the fixed camera grid and disappeared toward the retrieval point without a diver in the water. The next was due within 48 hours of publication. The second article was different from the first. Elena had spent 2 weeks working sources, pulling public records, running the financial thread that Darius had outlined for her. The result was 3,100 words, naming Raymond Voss, naming Coastal Meridian Group, naming Senator Pruitt's investment connection, and laying out the permit anomaly that Marcus had identified, framed as an anonymous tip from a construction professional who had reviewed public filings. It included the underwater footage. Elena had fought him on that last point. The footage was the strongest element, but using it meant explaining how it had been obtained, and explaining that opened questions about Darius that he had not answered. "I'll answer them," he said. "On background, not for print." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're going to have to tell me what you actually are." "Mr. Cole." "What I was," he said. "And it doesn't change the story." She had agreed. She published on a Thursday morning. That same Thursday night, Calvin went back in the water. It was a mistake, and Darius knew it, even as he agreed to it. The IRS CI package had been received. He had confirmation, and the sensible thing was to wait for the agency to move. But Calvin had argued that the fixed cameras proved the submersible passed through the channel. They did not show what happened at the cradle. He wanted to mount a close-range recorder beside the recovery mechanism before the next run close enough to capture the container seals, the serial plate, and the entire transfer sequence without a diver in the water when the submersible arrived. Darius had agreed. He shouldn't have. Tullos had stationed a man on a boat 200 meters north of the channel entrance. Not to watch the water, to watch the boatyard, when the water surface disturbed at the wrong time, in the wrong spot. The man on the boat made a phone call. Calvin surfaced at the South Pier at 11:47 and found Darius waiting with a towel and a very bad expression. "They saw you," Darius said. Calvin took the towel. How long ago? Long enough for them to react. He turned the camera feed toward Calvin, the long lens footage showing the watcher on the north boat. Phone raised to his ear. "Someone got called. The channel is compromised. They'll scrub the transit." Calvin looked at the phone. "Then the transit gets scrubbed." "Yes. And the recorder never got placed." "Gone, Darius said. "We don't get another window." He stepped back and looked at the water. "That was my call. I made it wrong." Calvin didn't argue. That, more than anything, told Darius how bad it was. They were inside the shop when Darius's motion sensor triggered, not the perimeter sensors he had set around the equipment, but the one he had placed on the fuel dock. The camera feed showed two figures moving along the north face of the building, one carrying what looked like a 5-gallon container. "Back door," Darius said. They went out through the rear of the shop in under 4 seconds. Behind them, through the corrugated metal wall, Darius could hear liquid being poured against the exterior wood framing of the dry dock. He stopped. Later, 2 days later, when subpoenaed records arrived, it would show that the watcher on the north boat had called Tulos at 1131 p.m. 40 seconds later, Tulos had called Raymond Voss's private number. The call lasted 9 seconds. After making his call, the watcher brought the inflatable in and joined a second man at the fuel dock. On the encrypted drive inside the floor safe were 8 months of footage, the financial trail, and a complete duplicate of everything he had sent to IRS irreplaceable, 30 feet away. In the apartment above the shop, Malik was asleep. He'd worked a late shift and was staying the night. Darius reached for his phone. No signal. The cell jammer, a professional-grade unit, not something Tulos had bought at a hardware store, had gone active the moment the motion sensor triggered. The shop's power was already cut. The camera feed had been running on battery backup for the past 40 seconds. They had maybe 90 seconds before the accelerant was lit. No time for 911. No time for anything but the next decision. Darius turned back toward the building. Calvin grabbed his arm. "The drive is in a fireproof safe," he said, low and fast. "It's rated to 1,700 degrees. The shop burns. The safe survives. The rating is for 30 minutes. Darius said, "Those are wood frame walls. The kid can get out the window. He sleeps heavy." Calvin held his arm for 1 more second. Then he let go and moved not toward the shop, but wide left, around the north perimeter, toward the figures at the fuel dock. Darius went straight through the back door. The shop was not yet burning. The accelerant had been poured, but not yet lit. Tulos's man was still working the north side when Calvin came around the building corner and hit him with the full force of 230 pounds of former SEAL Team 4. The container went into the water. The second man ran. Inside, Darius had Malik up and moving in under 90 seconds. Half asleep and confused. Out the rear exit and across the gravel, lot to the street. The shop didn't burn, but the near thing of it, the two of them standing on the gravel lot at midnight, looking at a building that had come within a cigarette lighter of being gone, that settled something in Darius that he had not expected. Not fear, something else. The recognition that he had been managing this with the cold calculus of an operation, and had nearly gotten a 26-year-old kid killed because of it. He had been right about most things. He had been wrong about going back in the water. Those were not the same weight. And he had been treating them as though they were. Calvin found the jammer in the gravel where the second man had dropped it running, tore out its battery, and called Savannah police at 12:20. He gave them Tulos's name and the jammer unit as physical evidence. Bidam, Tulos, and the 2 men from the fuel dock were in custody. The man Calvin had taken down had Tullis's number saved under a single initial, with 3 directive messages sent less than 90 minutes before the attempt. The second man was picked up at a gas station on the south side before 4 in the morning. Tullis was arrested at a motel outside Pula shortly after 5. The vehicle and the lot-matching plates from the gas station camera footage, Voss and Ellery, were not yet in custody. The federal team wanted the men who had given the orders. Not only the men who had carried them out, it was a series of fast decisions made in the dark. And it had worked partly because of 8 months of preparation, and partly because Calvin Broussard could still move in the dark at 55, and partly because Malik slept in his boots when he worked late. Voss had panicked. That was the thing Darius had counted on. That was the thing that hadn't changed. But Darius had also pushed too far. And it had nearly cost him everything he was trying to protect. He sat with that through the rest of the night. On Sunday morning, Gerald Fitch called the IRS CI duty line. That afternoon, he arrived in Atlanta with the deletion logs, 6 months of preserved communications, and copies of the 2 retention memos Voss had ignored by Sunday evening. A federal prosecutor had assembled a task force, IRS CI, for the financial case, Homeland Security investigations for the smuggling, Coast Guard for the maritime component. The search warrant affidavits were already drafted from Darius's package, and the arson arrests. Fitch's archive supplied the final corroboration. A magistrate judge signed the warrants that night. Federal agents executed the 3 search warrants simultaneously at 6:15 Monday morning, the Chatham County Port Authority Administrative Building, the Savannah office of Coastal Meridian Group, and a receiving warehouse on the north side of the port, registered to a Coastal Meridian subsidiary, the same warehouse where the transfer containers had been logged as reclaimed construction metal. Patrick Ellery was arrested at his home in the Ardsley Park neighborhood at 6:41. He was in his bathrobe. He did not say anything on the way to the Federal Processing Center. He was a man who understood, with the clarity that only handcuffs produce, that the calculation had changed. Raymond Voss was arrested at the Port Authority building at 7:03. He had arrived early. He had not slept. He was sitting at his desk, staring at a blank screen, when the agents came through the door. He did not ask to see the warrant. He already knew what was on it, what the warehouse search confirmed, and what Elena Vasquez documented through 4 intermediary companies, and the Chilean export paperwork was simpler and more complete than either Darius or Calvin had fully mapped. The containers went to the receiving facility, logged as reclaimed construction metal, were smelted and recertified on site, and entered legitimate supply chains with clean provenance documents. The Chilean paperwork was real. The declared commodity was not. The operation had been running for 3 years under 5 shell company names. Savannah was its newest access point, not its only one. Special Agent Kenway's relationship with Senator Pruitt and the Pruitt Family Investment Trust's stake in Coastal Meridian were referred for a separate conflict of interest review. Elena Vasquez's follow-up piece included a passage that Darius read 3 times the names of 23 families across 4 Savannah area waterfront communities who had been displaced, financially damaged, or targeted through Voss's regulatory operation, 11 at Riverside Wharf alone, among them the Simmons family, who had operated their bait and tackle shop since 1991, more than 30 years. The Delacroix brothers, who had spent $4,000 fighting a fraudulent fuel storage citation. Walter Bream, whose commercial fishing license remained in administrative review for 7 months. One interview, a woman named Claudette Okafor, whose family had received the first citation in the series, said, "I thought we were just unlucky. I didn't know there was a word for what they were doing to us." 2 weeks after the arrests, Darius drove to Atlanta. He had not told Marcus he was coming. He parked outside the office building where Marcus worked, sat in his truck for 15 minutes, and then went inside and asked the receptionist to let his son know he was in the lobby. He was not sure Marcus would come down. Marcus came down. They went to a diner 2 blocks from the office. Marcus ordered coffee. Darius ordered coffee. For a while they sat without speaking, which had always been their natural condition, and which had always meant 2 different things to each of them. To Darius, it meant comfort. To Marcus, it had always meant distance. I read the ProPublica piece. Marcus said finally. The second one, the long one. Okay. They don't say what you did before. Before Savannah? No. Marcus looked at him. Were you going to tell me? Darius thought about the night he had sat at the workbench with the offer letter and the phone still warm from their conversation. He thought about what it would have cost to call Marcus back and say, here is why I can't take the money. Here is who I am. He thought about whether he had chosen not to say it to protect Marcus or to protect himself. I don't know. He said. It was the most honest thing he'd said in 7 years. Marcus was quiet. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. My whole life. Marcus said, you were doing that my whole life and you never. He stopped. Started again. I used to think you were hiding something shameful. That was the only thing that made sense to me. Why else would someone just not say? I didn't know how to make it make sense outside of it. Darius said, that life, it doesn't translate well. You could have tried. Yes. Darius said, I could have. They sat with that. Are you going to stay in Savannah? Marcus asked. Yes. Marcus nodded. He picked up his coffee, set it down. I'm going to come down in the spring. He said, when it's warmer. Okay. Darius said, you can show me the yard. I can do that. It was not forgiveness. It was not reconciliation. It was a door left slightly open by 2 people who did not entirely know how to open doors. Darius understood that the 7 years would not compress into one conversation, and that some part of what Marcus had grown up without a father he could read. A history he could hold on to was not returnable. He drove back to Savannah that evening. He crossed the bridge over the Savannah River as the sun was going down, and the water was orange and flat and wide, and the Spanish moss moved very slightly in the marsh breeze, and the city spread out on either side of the water like something that had been there a long time and intended to remain. A month after the arrests, the Chatham County Port Authority suspended all pending enforcement actions against Riverside Wharf businesses, pending a federal review of the citation process. The Miss Lorraine was returned to Thomas Brough with a written apology from the interim Port Authority Director, Coastal Meridian Group. Its Savannah assets frozen by court order 3 weeks after the warehouse raid, had filed for bankruptcy protection. The same week, 3 of the 7 families displaced before the arrests had entered compensation negotiations with the court-appointed receiver. The Simmons family did not reopen their bait shop. They had moved their lives on. Some things, once dismantled, are not exactly reassembled. They are rebuilt into something slightly different. And what was lost in the original version remains lost. Even if the new version holds. Darius stood at the end of his pier one cold morning in December, his coffee going cold in his hand, watching a brown pelican work the far edge of the channel. The water was low and clear, and he could see 8 feet down to the sandy bottom near the dock pilings and further out. In the main channel cut, the pale rectangular mark in the sediment where Coast Guard divers working with the federal task force had documented the retrieval cradle 3 weeks earlier and lifted it out in sections. He thought about what he had given up. Not the big things, the small ones, the idea that he could remain entirely unknown in Savannah, that the version of himself that had walked away from one life and built another could stay intact without ever being touched by the previous one. Eleanor's piece had been careful. She had honored their agreement, kept his background vague, framed his knowledge as that of an experienced maritime professional, but the people who needed to understand what that meant had understood it. The 2 lives he had kept separate for 19 years now touched at the edges, and they would never be entirely separate again. It was a small loss. He knew that, against what had been protected, against the 23 names in Elena's article, against the Miss Lorraine back in her slip, and Thomas Bro pulling traps on the river again. It was very small, but small things, he had learned, were what you felt the longest. He finished his cold coffee and went back into the shop. The hydraulic lift was groaning in the cold and needed recalibration. He had 3 boats due in the next week, and a backlog from the shutdown that would carry him into February. Pear was already there, wiping down the secondary workbench with a rag, as if he had never left. He picked up his tools and got to work. They can take your vessel. They cannot take what you know about the water beneath it. If you were in Darius's position, the night that offer letter arrived, $180,000. Marcus reaching out for the first real conversation they'd had in years. And the easier choice sitting right there. What do you do? If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs it. Subscribe. There's more where this came from.